All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Marianne, the general manager at City Bookshop. Thanks for being here in person or online if you're joining us there. Has anyone been here before? A couple people. Anyone here for the first time? A few people. Awesome. Well, thank you all again for being here. We're excited to celebrate The Forbidden Book, a historical fantasy and mystery steeped in Jewish culture and mythology, which I loved, and I'm so excited to hear discussed by Sacha, the author, and Ariel Kaplan. It's going to be such a great conversation. If you enjoy tonight's event, you should also see what else we have coming up at the store. We've got book clubs, more book events. We have an event for George O'Connor on Tuesday, who does mythological comics. We also have teen and tween book clubs and a YA book club for adults called Wine and Angst. You can find more about all of that at eastcitybookshop.com. Few very quick housekeeping notes. If you have a cell phone, we'll ask you to silence it before we start. We'll have a discussion of the book and then time for a Q&A followed by a signing line. If you have questions, you can ask them in person or submit them using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And most importantly, if you need to purchase a book tonight, we've got them all upstairs at our register, and they're also available for purchase on our website. So now for introductions. Tonight's author is Sacha Lamb. Sacha is a 2018 Lambda Literary Fellow in Young Adult Fiction and graduated in Library and Information Science and History from Simmons University. Sacha lives in New England with a miniature dachshund mix named Ansu Bean. Their debut novel, When the Angels Left the Old Country, was named a Prince Honor Book, a Sidney Taylor Award winner, and a Stonewall Book Award winner. In conversation with Sacha is Ariel Kaplan. Ariel grew up outside Washington, D.C., and spent most of her childhood reading fairy tales and mythology before settling on a deep love for Jewish folklore. She began studying the history of medieval Spain and the convivencia while working on a Monroe Scholar project at the College of William and Mary, where she graduated with a degree in history and religious studies. She's the author of several books for young readers. The Mirror Realm Cycle is her first adult fantasy series. Please give me a warm welcome to Sacha and Ariel.
Thank you. Hello. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Should I start by just telling a little bit about the book?
Absolutely. I would love to hear.
So the Forbidden Book, it takes place in the Pale of Settlement in the 1870s in a shtetl that I invented. And it's about a young girl who, on the night before her wedding, decides that she cannot go through with it and leaps out the window and takes on a male identity. But then it turns out that the name she's using belongs to a real person, and everyone in the town wants him dead.
I love the premise so much. I love the book. So I'm really excited to be here talking to Sacha about this book because they sent me a copy and I loved everything about it. I loved Sacha's earlier book as well. The characters are very unique, and I think I guess my first question is, so it's hard to know what to ask about that isn't spoilery, but Sorrel and Isser, who is Sorrel's
her twin, her double, her
alternate identity, I guess you could say, without giving too much away, have kind of a unique relationship in the book, which is very much the heart of the story. She is the very sheltered daughter of a rich merchant. He is a book smuggler, among other things. How did you come to develop these two very different characters? And I guess my question really is, how do you develop these characters, and what do you start with in a story like this? Do you start with the characters or do you start with plot?
What I usually start with is a scene, and the scene gives me a character and some kind of movement that is going to give me a plot direction. So with this one, it was the scene of the night before her wedding, a girl who's been fasting all day and is kind of losing it. And then she hears this voice that's like, you can't do this. And she's like, well, I have to, though. There's no other choice. And the kind of other self is like, well, if you can't run, I will run for you. And that was the scene that this started with. And it is a Dybbuk story, not to completely spoil everything, but the idea of this moment where a Dybbuk enters into a bride on the night before the wedding. I wanted to do that story, but fully leaning into the kind of gendered implications of Dybbuk possession. So I know you had a question about about Dybbuk.
I do have a question about Dybbuk. So yeah, so Sorrel is possessed by this Dybbuk, but in this case, he's not malevolent, at least not to Sorrel, which is sort of a key detail. I would love to hear a little bit more about Dybbuk stories and how the Forbidden Book fits into. It's a very particular genre of Yiddish folklore, I think.
Yes, I was very much kind of working off of Ansky's Dybbuk, which is probably the most famous work of Yiddish theater, although it was originally written in Russian. But um, in that story, you have the setup of the bride who's possessed on the night before her wedding. And in that case, it's her dead, once promised fiance. And there's a lot of kind of queer angles that you can read into this play because the sin that allows the Dybbuk to enter into Leah is that her father had promised his father that their children would marry. So it's almost a marriage between these two fathers. And in breaking the vow, the father allows his daughter to become this masculinized kind of dual gendered figure possessed by the Dybbuk. And so there's kind of a lot of queer angles and queer readings, and it almost felt like, as a queer Jewish author, I should do a take on the Dybbuk, not in a way where I'm like, oh, I'm obligated. I have to do it. It was more like, ooh, you know what I can do now? I can do the Dybbuk and fully go into this, like the idea of cross-dressing as a gender awakening and a Dybbuk possession where the ending isn't that the Dybbuk has to be gotten rid of because he's ruining her life. It's like, actually, maybe this is a better kind of situation to be in. So it was really playing on Ansky and leaning really into all of the queer angles of Ansky's Dybbuk that he was also working from the folklore that he collected in his ethnographical research, where quite often it would be that a girl was possessed by a masculine spirit, and sometimes even by a spirit of a Torah scholar or a great rabbi. And as a Dybbuk, you can speak in a masculine voice of religious authority that a girl could never have. And so it's this weird situation where obviously the act of possession itself is kind of transgressive and sinful, but it also allows a girl to have a kind of authority within the Jewish religious space that as a girl she can't have. So it's very like the ways that Dybbuk possession is gendered were very interesting from folklore itself, and then Ansky used that folklore, and then I used Ansky. So that's how we arrived at the Forbidden Book, a kind of transgender queer Dybbuk story.
That's so great. Now I need to go back and read that because I would like to sort of be able to have a conversation in my head between that work and yours. If we're going to talk about sort of queer Yiddish literature, I think it's time to bring up Yentl. Obviously, there's two different versions of Yentl. There is sort of the OG singer short story, which I think people are generally a little less familiar with, and then there's Barbra Streisand. They're quite different. They're both quite queer in different ways. Barbra Streisand, Yentl, it leans very heavily into, I think, the bisexuality of the characters, but Yentl is a woman in the Barbra Streisand version. In the original story, Yentl is very much on the page a trans person. Yentl says at some point about their gender, I'm neither one or the other. And the opening of the Forbidden Book reminded me so much of how Yentl starts in the story, where she's putting on a boy's clothes and running off because she wants to get married. Are there other examples in Yiddish? I mean, you talked about the Dybbuk, but are there other examples? Because I feel like that can't be the only thing that's quite so, it's so on the page in Yentl. I feel like there must be other examples.
Yentl is pretty iconic and pretty stands out a lot. But I do have a couple of examples, not from Yiddish literature, but from actually the Yiddish press, the Yiddish newspapers. One of them was somebody wrote a letter into the Vorwärts talking about this person from their shtetl who was a young girl, but went away to the big city and had the operation and came back as a man. And like, according to the letter writer, this was just kind of taken in stride. We don't have the voice of the actual transmasculine person who supposedly experienced this, but it was very interesting that that could have been a possibility. And then there's another anecdote that I find really fascinating that was in one of the Polish newspapers in the interwar period, and this appears in Bad Rabbi by Eddie Portnoy, which is a collection of kind of quirky stories from the Yiddish press. And it's about this little group of document forgers who had two kinds of purpose. They would make fake papers for Jews who, because of the anti-Semitic laws, couldn't get travel permits or work permits and needed those to live. And then the other type of person that they would forge documents for was men who were living a gay life in the city and didn't want their name attached to their gay city life to get back to their families. And so they would take on a new identity that these forgers were providing for them. And unfortunately, we know that story because they were arrested, the forgers. But I like to think that maybe there were other cases of these little queer microcosms within the world of Jewish Eastern Europe where maybe they didn't run across the police and they weren't arrested, and therefore we don't know anything about them. And there could be a Yentl who is living a transmasculine life and just gets away with it for decades. Like there were cases not in the Jewish world, but in the Anglophone newspapers of people who had lived for decades under male identities after being assigned female at birth, and their male identity wasn't discovered until they died, or for other reasons, kind of sometimes it was neighborhood rumors that finally came out and things like that. So they're people who had lives that lasted quite a long time under a chosen identity rather than an identity that was placed upon them. So I like to imagine that there are many more that we don't know about. And it's kind of a happier ending to not know, because the ways that queer history gets uncovered are often unpleasant.
It means that they were successful in living the way that they wanted to. If nobody knew about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So sort of bridging from sort of the queerness of the story to the more folkloric element, one of the things I noticed is that the way the sort of fabulistic, is that a word, elements of the story sort of are interwoven with the more mundane things. It's very characteristic of Jewish literature from this period, where it's, somebody is possessed with a dybbuk and everybody says, well, of course they are. And nobody, and in the story, I don't think this is too spoilery, nobody questions what's happening to Sorrel. Nobody says, are you sure?
It can't be a dybbuk. There's no such thing.
Right. It's just everybody's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that seems right.
Yeah, it sounds right. And so it does feel very much like a story of the period it's taking place in that way, but it does have the more modern sensibilities also. Mm-hmm. And how do you balance that when you're writing? Is it a matter of how you approach the subject matter, how you approach the language? Like, how do you make it feel so much? Because it really does feel like a Yiddish story, except it's also, modern.
Yeah. I work very hard at it. I want it to be that way. One of the things that I thought about a lot with this book in particular is the way that you have to balance, as a historian also, in telling stories about history, you have to balance the way people at the time thought about the moment they lived in versus the way that moment is reflected on our time. So I was writing about a moment in Jewish history that's fairly unfamiliar compared to the Ellis Island migration story that I told with When the Angels Left the Old Country. And so it's set in the 1870s, like it's before the wave of pogroms that sent a lot of Jews emigrating from the Russian Empire. It's before it became clear that the direction that the Russian Empire was going in was definitively an anti-Semitic direction. Like people who were politically active at this time a lot of them thought maybe assimilation was the answer. And that seemed possible. So it's this period of kind of unsettled historical, an unsettled historical moment where people don't quite know yet what is going to happen. And of course, looking back on it, we're like, how could you think that anti-Semitism was not a problem? But they didn't know. And so you never know what's going to happen next. But at the same time, people are reading this book in 2024. And so in writing a book about this period of history, what really jumped out to me from the perspective of 2023, 2024 was book censorship. This is a period when the Russian Empire was increasing the amount of censorship on Jewish texts, on Jewish religious texts, Jewish political texts that were not specific to Jews but were written in Yiddish, which is mostly what Isser is selling to housewives. And so I had people who challenged When the Angels Left the Old Country on the basis of it's basically being on a Stonewall award-winning list. They went down the list. They challenged every single book on the list. They challenged my friend's book, Beetle and the Hollowbones, which is a middle grade graphic novel because it has girls kissing in it, and it's not even on the lips, it is on the cheek. And my book, they challenged because it has friendship between angels and demons, which tells me they didn't read it because that is a romance between an angel and a demon. So book censorship was very important to me. And looking back at this moment of Jewish history, I was like, wow, book censorship and rogue librarians. And so I wrote this character who's kind of a rogue librarian of his time. And he's not peddling gay angel literature, but
He could have been.
He could have been. He could, well, maybe he is. If you think about it, what is in that forbidden book? Yeah, so it was really about kind of finding the thing in this moment of history that is unfamiliar, the thing that is familiar within this unfamiliar moment, and focusing in on what I really care about, which is books.
No, another question about sort of the folklore of it, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong because I've actually never heard it said out loud. She's in all the stories. Is
Agrat bat Machlat.
Yes, yes. So Agrat, she's in a lot of Yiddish stories. She is a demon, but in the Forbidden Book, sometimes she's a demon and sometimes she's described as an angel. And that's very interesting. And I think it speaks a bit to, if you read a lot of Jewish folklore, demon is not really the right word in English. It's the word we got. It doesn't necessarily have a real negative connotation. A lot of the demons in the folklore are Jewish.
Yes.
And they're actually rather nice people. Like they're not necessarily bad. Sometimes they are, but
one day could be bad and Jewish, which is always interesting.
Oh, there you go. There's a question here. Can you talk a little bit about demons in Jewish folklore?
Yes.
And how your Agrat fits into that?
Yes, this is definitely something that I may never stop exploring, the idea of angels versus demons and the overlap between angels and demons. I wrote one whole book about it, and then I came back with this one and I was like, angels of death. What's going on with the angel of death, who is definitively an angel, but also pretty definitively a negative figure, except for the goofy bits where it can't remember people's names and gets confused and is really easy to fool. And if you keep praying and don't take a breath, then the angel can't get you, etc., etc. So the angel of death is like the most demonic angel. And Agrat Bat Machlat is the female angel and mostly described as a demon. She's associated with Lilith. She's got a couple of nights of the week when she can cause pandemonium because some great rabbi who, I'm sorry, I can't remember which great rabbi it was, sort of wrote a contract with her where he was like, you can't cause mayhem every day of the week. You can only cause mayhem on Wednesday nights and I forget, Saturday night, Thursday night, a couple of nights of the week, she's allowed to cause mayhem. And she's usually described as a demon, but in some of the really ancient texts, she is the one instance of a female angel. And I thought that was really interesting. First, the idea that a female angel becomes a demon. And then just like what is it that makes her a demon versus an angel, and how can an angel be female if angels don't have gender, but also angels are usually gendered masculine? So I was just playing with kind of the concepts of angels of death and female demons and the overlap between angels of death who are female and demons who are also female. Um, and I kind of wrote her as like a sexy vampire lady because I thought that would be fun. And then I was like, thinking also about the idea of the level of villain coding that a sexy vampire lady kind of inherently has, and then if you write that character but you're not sure that she's actually completely villainous, which no one in this story is fully villainous. Everyone's trying to accomplish something for the Jewish community, and no one can agree on how to go about that, which I think is familiar to many of us in communities. So no one quite is completely wrong, but no one has it completely right either, and that includes the angels. Because everybody in this little shtetl, they've been left off of the railroad. They're kind of in an economic decline. Some people want to be independent but Polish. Some people want to be more Russian. Some people want to be whatever. And the angels are also tied up in this, even though theoretically, as an angel, you could say, this doesn't matter. This is one shtetl, and like, I can leave. I'm an angel. But they don't. So they're kind of all mired in this one shtetl's problems, and that's really what I had the most fun playing with, was the idea of these angels who are also there. Like, everybody's got problems. Everybody's kind of up to their ankles in mud in this little shtetl on the edge of the river. And the angels, who could just leave at any time because they have wings, are like, no, I really care about this dumb little shtetl in the middle of nowhere. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's why Agrat Bad Maharaj is there.
No, it definitely did. No, there are a lot of really interesting aspects with the angels who were sort of stuck there, and also the fact that like the shtetl is like it's got problems and it's got a lot of beggars, but on the other hand, compared to other problems, it's really not so bad. I mean, like the Cossacks are not coming,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So,
yeah, and I thought it
you
would be
take choices, right?
I was kind of interested in writing a story where the proximate villain is not just the personification of anti-Semitism, because I don't know, I think there's more to Jewish history than that. And there are periods where the biggest problem for Jews is other Jews who are annoying. And so I kind of wanted to explore that a little, and like the relationship between Isser and Sorrel and their mutual father figure, Sorrel's actual father, sort of the father figure for Isser. Their relationship is problematic, but it's problematic in a way that relationships between fathers and their children are problematic. And it's also problematic because they are two different generations of people who have different ideas of what the Jewish community should do about their economic decline. So I'm really hoping that people will follow the story about teens and their bad father and not be too tripped up on the full explanation of the politics of a tiny shtetl that I invented. So but I did have a really good time writing the complicated politics of this moment in history. So
Yeah, no, I definitely enjoyed that. I also enjoyed, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name, the rabbi's son.
yes,
Shulam
Yontif, poor thing.
Yes, I would like to read a follow-up about Shulam if there's one like kicking around in there.
My mom has a fanfic about Shulam Yontif where she thinks that he moves to Odessa and becomes a jazz musician. See, you can once you read it, you can decide if you feel like this would be a good ending for Shulam Yontif, poor thing.
Speaking of Shulam Yontif, the jazz musician, so and actually that it is a good segue. So like you started off, your first book was When the Angels Left the Old Country, which won every award pretty much that was up for the year it came out. It was a big book. And we talked about this a little bit in the back room, but do you feel like the combination of sort of the shifts in the market where suddenly writing Jewish YA is a thing now in a way that it wasn't, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've got more freedom to explore sort of non-typical settings, non-typical themes. I don't want to say weird, but you can talk about weird stuff too, but also just think that, like, they're a little riskier for publishers. Do you feel like you've got a little bit more that you can go with now? And do you feel like writing these 2 books now has sparked some ideas for something new?
Yeah, I don't think that I would have written the Forbidden Book as a first book because it is highly specific. Like the setting is specific, the timing is specific. My ideas is that of where I got the plot and the characters from are all pretty specific and can get very deeply down these academic rabbit holes about history and Yiddish literature and all of that. And it's a little easier with Angels to be like, oh, it's an Ellis Island immigration story. And everyone's like, we know what that is. So I do feel like the really overwhelmingly positive response to Angels and the fact that it completely earned out its advance really quickly, and people have been so nice to me, and people have been inviting me to do events and all of this. It really gave me a lot of confidence where I was like, I can go to Arthur with absolutely anything. Arthur Levine, my editor, I can tell him I am writing a really specific story about a tiny shtetl that I made up. And he will say, yeah, that sounds great. And that indeed happened. He did. And the book is now out. And I do think maybe if I had pitched the Forbidden Book as a first project, maybe Arthur would still have bought it. But I don't know for sure. And I think that Angels really gave me the freedom to be like, I can do anything now. And people are going to say, well, they did one good book, so this one's worth checking out. Which also has its own kind of pressure on it where I'm like, what if people don't like this one and they're like, oh, something happened to Sacha Lamb? But that has not been the case so far. People have been very nice about my second and weirder book. So I hope you all enjoy it as well.
No. Yeah, I'm excited to read what you have next. Absolutely. I think everybody is. But speaking as like we're talking about changes in the market, 10 years ago, there was very little.
Yes.
If you were really lucky, if you wanted sort of a Jewish book, a Jewish historical book, you got a Holocaust book. And if you were lucky, the main character was actually Jewish in the Holocaust book, and very often not. And then, the shift around, I think Golem and the Genie was 2008. And I'm trying to think if that was really like, I picked that up on vacation in a coffee shop, and the fact that that was mainstream enough to find it in the coffee shop was a huge deal. And I thought when I picked it up, something's different now. And I think that was an adult book, but YA really is starting to steamroll. Do you feel like maybe there are some titles because I'm sure that people who love your books are like, okay, what else? What else can I put on my shelf?
Yes, well, I think they should read The Pomegranate Gate for one thing. It's marketed as adult, but I think it's also appropriate for young adult readers, and I think it's just great. Like the main character has this incisive Talmudic reasoning that annoys everyone around her so much. But a couple of my other favorites I really liked From Dust to Flame by Rebecca Potus, which came out a few years ago. Aidan Polydoros has a few Jewish fantasies now. He has the Partisan Golem one, The City Beautiful, which is a Chicago Dybbuk story. And then he has kind of if Shadow and Bone actually had fantasy Jews in it, is kind of how I would describe the Bone Weaver. And I do also quite enjoy Lee Bardugo's works, which are a little more kind of crypto-Jewish in their fantasy setting, but I definitely think there's Jewish readings that are interesting to be done there. And let's see, Levine Querido has some middle grade Golem Crafters by Emmy Watanabe Cohen. It's not out yet, but it will soon be out, and I'm excited for it. It's middle grade about Golem Crafters, and I think Emmy's kind of underrated. Her first book, The Lost Ryu, was really good. So look forward to Golem Crafters. And yeah, I'm really happy that my Jewish fantasy shelf is no longer this wide. It's like this wide. And I'm really hoping that soon it will be the whole width of the shelf. So If any of you are writers, you have to also write things for me to read.
That's great. That is a great list. Thank you. I don't know if there's anything, I've run through my notes, but if there's anything else you wish I had asked, or if you want to answer some questions from the
I
audience.
would love audience questions, and that they can be about either of my books or anything else that you want to
We
ask.
can talk about Yentl some more.
We could talk about Yentl. Yes, My Chemical Romance. So the question was, what was different about the process for each book? Angels wrote itself in a weird way. Yeah. I don't really remember what it was like writing my short stories, so I'll stick with the novels. But Angels really almost wrote itself because the energy of the relationship between Little Ash and Oriel, it was a really good choice to write a Havrusa at the core of a story because of the push and pull. Really, they like drove the plot from start to finish. I thought I was writing a short story, and then I had like 75,000 words, and I was like, oh, this is not a short story at all. This is a long story. And so that it almost wrote itself. It was really quite easy to go from the idea to the manuscript, and then it was really about honing and refining it into the book that you ultimately got, which is actually slightly longer than the first draft and much shorter than the second draft. The second draft went all over the place. And Arthur was like, don't do that. And he was right. And then with the Forbidden Book, I had so much of I can't write Angels again. Like, I think that Angels is completely watertight. I can't think of anything I would change about it. It's been 2 years and I've had a lot of time to think about it. People have asked me a lot of questions about it. I can't think of anything I would change. Whereas the Forbidden Book is a book. And I think it's good. I did my very best, but it's not perfect. And you can't write more than one perfect book in a row. That would be wild. And so I do have a certain amount of, as I was writing it, I was like really getting up against this mental block of like, I can't write a perfect first draft. I can't write a perfect book as a first draft. And so what I really had to do was tell myself, all right, then write the worst book that you can imagine. And in the end, I wrote a pretty good book. So if I do say so myself. So
to be fair, every single writer I know has horrible nerves writing their second book, their second published book. I don't know anybody who hasn't had that experience where you're sitting there thinking, I'm a hack and everyone's going to find out.
You sit there and you think, I don't remember how I wrote the first one. What if I only have one book? What if I never figure it out? And one of the things that was really hard about the Forbidden Book was because I had a murder mystery in it. And when I started writing, I didn't know who did it. So I got a decent way into my first draft and I had to sit down and do like a Charlie from Always Sunny red string conspiracy board for myself where I was like, here's all the suspects and here's why they might have done it and here's why Sorrel refuses to consider that they're the one who did it and here's why they definitely did it. And so I literally have this little murder board that I had to make for myself. And then I had to go back and write Isser's point of view to sort of fill in the clues that Sorrel doesn't have access to. So it was a very different process where with Angels, I wrote it literally from scene 1 through until scene whatever at the end. And with this one, I wrote probably 2/3 of it, realized that I needed to solve the murder before I could write the solution to the murder, solved the murder, went back, wrote 2/3 of it from a different point of view, and then wrote the final act. So it was a very different kind of situation in terms of how the story came together. Did you have a question there on the question was my niche is sort of historical Jewish fantasy and whether I have thought of writing modern Jewish fantasy. I'm kind of very much stuck in my historical fiction mode right now because it's really for a while I was reading all the queer YA that was coming out, and a lot of it was contemporary, and contemporary isn't kind of my home genre. I'm really a fantasy and historical fiction person. So I got a little bit burnt out on contemporary just from reading all of the queer YA, and most of it was that. So I'm not currently in the mind space where I'm thinking about that. Although my first published work, Avi Cantor Has 6 Months to Live, was more of a contemporary, and that is available online for free. You do not have to pay me to read it. Please send it to all of your young trans friends who don't have money because it's free. So yeah, but there's a couple that I really enjoyed. Rebecca Podes's From Dust to Flame is a contemporary Jewish fantasy. And I might in the future, we'll see. Yes. There's another person behind you. I'll save you in the queue. I'll remember that you raised your hand. Yes, you in the front.
There's clearly so much research that goes into these books. And I'm curious at what point in the process, in your writing process, research comes in. Is that something that to have that scene as the seed of the idea, and then you do the research to ground it, or is this stuff that you're sort of researching for fun all the time, and so you pretty quickly see how a story fits into it? I'm just curious where in the process that happens.
So repeating questions for the Zoom audience. This question was, where in the process does my research come? And it's kind of a mix. Usually there is a lot of just reading for fun. I do a lot of reading for fun constantly of history and history of infectious diseases and Jewish history and animal studies, which is a new field that I'm kind of excited about. That's like how animals have interacted with humans throughout history. So I'm kind of always doing that in the background. And then usually what happens is I have the scene idea that's kind of the seed of a story where I'm like, ooh, this has potential to go somewhere. And then I will think, what are the kind of details around this scene that I'm going to need to know? And then I'll go more in depth, collecting everything that is related to that. So for this one, I had the Dybbuk idea. So I was like, well, I have to read the Dybbuk again. And I'm going to think about a certain moment in time, and I wanted it all to be set within the Pale. I didn't want to do another immigration story, just to get a different vibe. So I read a lot about Jewish life in the Pale in the late Russian Empire and slightly before that. And then I went back and actually wrote. So usually the research is kind of before or in the middle. Yes.
So my question is, what part of like research and editing do you find?
What part of research and writing and editing is the most engaging? I actually really like being edited because it's like you hand your thing to someone and they come and they polish it up and you're like, ooh, wow, it looks so nice now. Although it's more like they hand you the little spray and the cloth and they're like, you can polish it now. And then I polish it and I'm like, wow, it looks so good. But there's different parts of everything that are fun in different ways. I really like doing research just because I like learning stuff. And probably my favorite part of the process, though, is there's a moment in the drafting process where I start to feel like all the pieces are fitting together. You know, when you're making a jigsaw and you're like 2/3 of the way through and suddenly everything speeds up with every piece that you put? There's a moment in the drafting process where it also feels like that. And you're like, ooh, my foreshadowing is paying off and my payoffs have been foreshadowed and everything's fitting together like that. And that's really exciting. That's probably my favorite moment. Were there any? Marianne has a question. So the question was that some of the demons are sort of fairy-like, and where did that come from? And the answer to that is that I just wanted to write a fairy banquet, and I thought this will be fun. And so I just wanted to put that aesthetic in there. And I think that there's something about the Jewish angel demon figure that, according to a researcher called Sarah Ronis, who's looked really close into demons in the Talmud, it's likely that demons as presented in the Babylonian Talmud are really taken from the Zoroastrian kind of figures who are, spirits of the earth, and they're just kind of there in the same way that fairies are, or jinn in Islamic traditions. And so I was thinking about demons as fairies already, and I kind of, in angels, I think I describe Little Ash as what another people might call a fairy, but we Jews refer to as Shadim. And so I have this idea of Shadim and Jewish demons being fairy-like, and I thought I'm gonna lean all the way into this with this sexy vampire fairy lady who's got her weird banquet in her weird mansion. Just because it was fun. I wanted to do that aesthetic.
I think there are a lot of demons like that in the original folklore too. That you find whole communities of demons
Yes.
who are like, and they have their own rabbis. And,
You can sail to an island of demons and they're like, we want to eat you. And the rabbi's like, you have to say the blessing first before you eat it. Yes, the question again. Awesome. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a lot. It's like then they set that up. A lot of that, a lot of the stuff in
Yeah, so the question is, where am I getting my demon folklore from? And some of it is Talmudic and some of it isn't. A lot of it is from Daf Yomi, reading and writing down and everything that strikes my fancy, being like, ooh, here they say they have chicken feet, and here we have Ashmedai, who's a great scholar, and here we have the difference between demons and angels, and it's kind of not that different. And then some of it is sort of later folklore. I used a lot of Howard Schwartz's collections of folk and fairy tales from around the Jewish world. Like the tale of the Jerusalemite, where he sails off to an island and ends up married to a demon princess, and that's where the demons want to eat him, and the rabbi is like, no, we are Jews.
That's Barbarhana, right? The rabbi who's sailing off to the island.
It might be.
He sails around a lot, so
Yeah, he's sort of a Jewish Sinbad kind of figure. So I a lot of it was Talmud based, and a lot of it was later fairy tales, and just taking whatever I liked from every source. And then some of it I did just make up. Like Little Ash puts his tears in the angel's eyes to help it see something at one point, and I just made that up. Although it did have something to do with, it was definitely inspired. It was inspired by that bit of Brachas where they're like, here's how to see the demons that are secretly all around you at all times, and I'm like, I don't want to see them.
I don't do that.
he
Yes,
had to make sure you knew that.
Rabbis do not approve of the secret recipe that you put in your eyeballs to see demons. Don't try it at home, kids. The guy who did try it went blind, so don't do that. Probably because putting a burnt up cat organ in your eyeballs would give you a horrible infection. Or it could make you see demons. You never know. You never know. How badly do you want to see those demons? Were there any questions on the Zoom? No questions on Zoom? Okay.
Just to piggyback, I will say about Howard Schwartz, I'm a big Howard Schwartz fangirl. If you find his compilations of Jewish folk tales, he will tell you where they're coming from. And like,
yeah,
sometimes his introductions they're really worth their weight in gold if you're looking, because he pulls from Midrash, he pulls from everything, and he'll tell you. And he'll tell you what country it came from. He'll tell you like if there's like an estimated date.
When was it collected?
Yeah. And he'll even tell you like there's a through line, because a lot of the time you can see the same story told over and over again at different times and places, and he'll explain that to you too. So it's really pretty incredible work.
And then just a couple of other sources that I've used. I mentioned Sarah Ronis. The Demons in the Details is the title of her book. It's about demons in the Babylonian Talmud. Mika Ahuvia on my left, Michael on my right, Gabriel, or maybe the other way around. It is a book about angels in the Talmud. And then there was a rabbi called Rabbi Ronald Isaacs. I think he was associated with the conservative movement, and he wrote a bunch of books where he just took every citation from Talmud on a topic. So he has one on angels, he has one on medicine and miracles. And I have all of his books. They're out of print, but I found them on Thrift Books, and they're so useful. They're a little kind of dated because they're old enough that they're out of print. But what they do is that they have the collection. It's like before Safaria existed, it's a Safaria source sheet, but it's also on paper, so I can put a sticky note in it and flip through it, and they're very useful. Rabbi Ronald Isaacs. Any more questions before we move to signing time? Yes. The question was that I've said that the narrative voice for angels is like your great uncle telling you a story. It's the Princess Bride grandpa who comes in and he's like, "Let me tell you." Yes, I imagine him. I would have loved for the Angels audiobook to be voiced by Mandy Patinkin, but we didn't get Mandy. We got sort of another actor who has done Jewish stuff on the stage, and he is great. But someday I'll get you, Mandy. The narrative voice for Sorrel is a little less voicey. I would say I don't have as clear a picture of the character that the narrator would be. And that was on purpose because I didn't want to do the same thing again, and it didn't feel like it was quite the right tone. Sorrel is a little less of a fairy tale, although obviously it still has a lot of folkloric elements. But the voice is a little closer to neutral narrators and a little closer also to Sorrel herself, although Sorrel does not know her own feelings very well. So sometimes the narrator will tell you something that Sorrel does not know. Okay. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for asking questions. And we're going to do signing. Mariana is going to tell you what to do.
Yes, thank you so, so much to Sacha and Ariel for being here. Thank you all for coming. We are going to take just a moment to reset the space so we can do a signing here. Feel free to mill about. If you can help us out by folding your chairs and just putting them on the side of the room, that would be really wonderful. You heard so many wonderful things about the Forbidden Book, When the Angels Left the Old Country, and the Pomegranate Gate tonight that I really encourage you to buy them upstairs if you are so inclined and don't have them yet. And we will be right back here in a couple of minutes. And can we do one last round of applause to close out?